Welcome, Joseph, to Fully Booked. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm absolutely ecstatic to have you on the podcast, and I'm very excited to discuss your new novel, Nuclear Family. The first two classic questions are always, what is this novel about, and how did this book come to be?
Sure. It's a ghost story, foremost, and it's also a stoner comedy / family drama. And yeah, it's a book that I wrote to honor where I was born and where my family comes from. My father's side of the family originates in the northern area of the peninsula, which is now known as North Korea, while also honoring the trajectory that my family took in immigrating to Hawaii and having been raised here. So my book is about the intersection of these places, their shared colonial histories and histories of U.S. occupation and militarization, and how war operates and functions in the everyday, and the ways in which separations, because of the division of the peninsula, because of language barriers, and because of diaspora, how they resonate and linger throughout generations. And plot-wise, it's about the eldest son of a Korean plate lunch restaurant in Hawaii who is found attempting to cross the Korean DMZ, and the family back home faces the backlash that comes with the controversy of this crossing. And eventually we find out how he came to do such a thing, and that he was haunted by and possessed by a grandfather figure whom he's never met, but who he encounters upon returning to South Korea as a way to escape from his family and the restaurant obligations back in Hawaii.
That was a rich meal of an answer you just gave me. And I'm belly up to the buffet right now. And I feel like there are 1,000 ways we could go from there. Let's talk about that grandfather character, that maternal grandfather, because he is, in fact, the first character we meet in the book, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Could you give us a little more, when we encounter this character, what's going on?
Yes, so Pek Tae-woo is Jacob's grandfather, Grace's grandfather as well. And throughout the book, you start to see the ways in which these two are directly related to such a character. And yeah, the novel opens with Tae-woo at the Dora Observatory, where he's looking into the other side, looking into North Korea, and thinking about how he's been spending his entire afterlife attempting to cross this unpenetrable spiritual barrier that's prevented him from going back home. And we discover that he, upon dying, which is also where the first chapter takes us, he passes through a gate arm at the parking lot that he works at until his death, thinking that nothing will stop him from seamlessly passing through the Korean DMZ, though he's met with a surprise. And the book follows the trajectory of why he is so keen on returning, and we find out that he left behind a family in North Korea during the Korean War and during the mass shuffle across the Demilitarized Zone, the 38th parallel. And this is a story that is not uncommon, because many families have stories about losing loved ones during the war and afterward, and spending their lifetimes hoping and wishing to not only return to their ancestral villages or where their families come from in the north, but to locate the family members whom they haven't seen for, right now, it's almost 70 years and counting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we see how Jacob is then made to learn about this history and embody it, quite literally through his grandfather's possession of him. And so too does he become possessed with this knowledge of what crossing into North Korea means for his dead grandfather. And despite the dangers that it would pose to him in this reality, why his grandfather would stop at nothing to want to return.
Right, right. From the beginning, if I'm correct, Taewoo identifies himself kind of, as a ghost apart in a way, like there are ghosts and then there are ghosts. He is a ghost that is forgotten, but not without cause. He acknowledges, and that to be a forgotten ghost, it weakens him.
Yes.
He maybe is not up, he's not the Arnold Schwarzenegger of ghosts here. He's not like, in the possession business and, moving things around the room, generally speaking.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely stratification toward how well off our spirits are in this next life, as it directly correlates with who remembers them, who performs the ancestral rites, and feeds them annually on their death anniversary or on the holidays. And because Taewoo abandoned his family in South Korea, abandoning Jacob's mother and auntie and Baek Harmony, who also has her story of separation, he is forced to wander and is lost and aimless, and is the forces that are keeping him around are directly tied to what manifests the Korean DMZ as this barrier in his next life,
Right.
which also existed in his former life as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we jump to Hawaii, and his descendants are living there in this family. I think we meet Grace first, and
Yes.
part of the introduction to her is she's called Jacob's younger sister. And like right off the bat, you get such a clarity about the connective tissue, whether living or deceased, between family members, how, we all have our own names, but we are often called in relation to our relations as well.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, and speaking of feeding the family, they are, as you mentioned, the proprietors of, a small chain of Korean plate lunch places.
Yes.
At least one of which has been visited by kind of, this, a ghost who walks among us, Guy Fieri.
Yes, she is haunted by him in another way.
It's a really funny juxtaposition to have this family interacting, with Guy. In the past, we're told of their appearance on, of course, Triple D, diners, drive-ins, and dives, right?
Yeah.
And like that kind of like was a parallel, like there are so many just, so many devastating things dealt with in this novel, so many weighty, meaty things dealt with in this novel. And there's also so much humor and joy in this novel as well. And it's kind of like when you think of him there with the family and how they respond to him, I also think of, how back on the Korean Peninsula, you have in very close proximity to the DMZ, you have an actual amusement park. That's a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the coexistence of, war and play or absurdity throughout.
Yeah. There are, yes, the DMZ, as it opens, as we're introduced to the place in the opening chapter, it's through the observatory as a tourist site, and Taewoo expresses his frustration about how easily people move, coming to South Korea and visiting the DMZ in order to feel a thrill, to be in such close proximity to the unknowable, North Korea. And yeah, I find a lot of parallels between the Korean DMZ as the most militarized border in the world as a tourist site, and where Grace and her family live in Hawaii, which is over about 25% occupied by U.S. military bases, where people come to visit in order to to tour the Pearl Harbor Memorial, which presents a certain kind of narrative about the U.S. as a savior, as redeeming itself for having its assets attacked during Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, I absolutely wanted to show how these histories are interconnected, how the fences that are erected across the Korean Peninsula to divide Korea are linked to the fences that are put up around the military bases in Hawaii that prevent the native Hawaiian communities from returning to their own lands, which are used consistently for target practice, for military training. And one thing that I always think about is every time North Korea fires a ballistic missile, it makes the news and shakes up the world. But I'd also like to imagine if the US military made the news for every time it tested a weapon in Hawaii or elsewhere, it would be nonstop, the media coverage.
Right.
And just this upcoming summer, biennially, because the U.S. Pacific Command is located in Hawaii and is responsible for about half of the world's surface, militaries around the world gather in Hawaii for the Rim of the Pacific exercises and trainings, where they showcase new weapons technology, where they fire missiles into the ocean and blow things up. Polluting the ecosystems here. So yeah, we are always conditioned to be afraid of the imminent peril that might come because North Korea has a missile program. But I really wanted to put that into a larger context as to what Koreans remember about how the peninsula experienced devastating loss of the environment, of countless civilians, half of whom make up the nearly 4 million or more casualties on Korea, and to bear witness to how the U.S. is very much implicated in the ongoing war and has its investments in keeping Korea divided, keeping Daewoo and countless families from ever seeing their loved ones again.
Yes. There's not often a lot of silence in these podcasts, but I just wanted a couple of seconds there to marinate in the answer, and thank you for it. The follow-up question I have to that is a little bit of a pivot. This book is divided into 3 sections, and I was wondering how you perceived the relationship between the 3, or the connectivity there, or why you made that choice. Any part of that question is answerable.
That's a really I've never been asked that yet.
Oh, great.
But yeah, it's about, well, I thought a lot about the divisions across chapters. We see characters kind of siloed from one another. And we are very much in their interiority and following their own lives as they pull apart from one another and also strain the relations that bind them. And I guess I more so saw the 3 sections as a kind of symmetrical pattern where the first section deals with division and separation. And the last section, we have a return from, I guess I don't want to spoil too much, but returns on many levels.
Yes, that'll
characters,
do it.
returning to themselves, returning to their sense of home, to family, to the lands that nurture and feed them, and a return to the responsibilities that we carry because of our lineages to where we are born. For Grace, that's understanding her responsibility as a settler living on Hawaiian land and her responsibility to taking care of the land as a way to start taking care of herself instead of relying on substances. And returning to our family stories and honoring the stories that have shaped us and that continue to condition our lives and also the direction of our lives as we move in memory of our loved ones who are with us every day.
I'm going to pluck the word shape out of that shaped us. I'm going to pluck that word shape and ask you now about the book's unconventional formatting at times. For example, there's a 2-page spread in the book where the letters DMZ form horizontal line across the spread, and it's kind of like really concentrated in the middle. Like if you ever played with a typewriter when you were younger and you just kept on, retraining it right over the same space until it just kind of becomes an opaque black mass. Why did you introduce those sections of the book?
Yeah, I'm so glad people are liking those formal decisions. Well, writing the book, I very much felt like I had to write toward the DMZ and all it represents, and also against it. It very much felt like I was banging my head against the wall when it came to trying to get this book done.
Yeah.
And I had to write about the DMZ in all different ways, and visually, as I write about it in the novel, I thought we also had to actually see it as a disruptive force within the narrative pages. And that as a reader, we too must pass through and look for an opening in the same way that Teu is searching for such an opening, and discovers that it is possible, that the barrier is porous and living creatures and beings can cross through it pretty seamlessly, but not without consequence, and without danger. And yeah, it's a question of why that danger remains and who it serves for Korea to continue to be divided. But I was very much inspired by concrete poetry when it came to designing those moments. Danmi Choi, for one, her pair of books, Hardly War and DMZ Colony, gave me the language and visual language that I needed to understand how to tackle the DMZ in all ways, both figuratively and textually and visually. And I wanted to create moments that were unforgettable, that long after folks finish the book, that if there is one thing that they remember, it is that spread right in the middle. And the question of that concentration, which starts to look like a redaction of the letters DMZ, and a way for us to think about our passages and the portals that we create in our memories to connect ourselves back to the unknowable, whoever's on the other side. And yeah, I think about that constantly. I I know nothing about how my grandfather was raised in the Northern Peninsula, about his parents and grandparents and how they lived um, in Korea. And anytime anyone talks about or speaks about Korea in a US context, they're usually foremost talking about South Korea first.
Yeah.
And and even at the level of using proper pronouns in the novel, I made it a very conscious point to not have to capitalize every instance or reference to North or South, because to me, those are just directions. But to the world, these directions are qualified as states and entities and governments. But the novel in its fragmentation pushes toward a sense of wholeness by the end of the book, even with such a very disruptive moment as the false missile, or which occurs towards the end of the book. And it's this return to wholeness and toward healing, which I think passing through the DMC signals at the level of moving through the book, but also in our own consciousness and imaginary, because it's so fixed as an entity in our minds, and we assume that it's always been there, but it really hasn't. And perhaps we can also question whether it must remain.
I'm seeing that we are approaching our allotted time together, and I thank you for your generosity with me. And I ask if you would be game for one more question.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Because you really have inspired me. I'm generally, no, I mean it. I'm generally interested in the revision process, and I might ask you something about that. But now I kind of want to turn that idea on its ear and ask, I don't know if this is fair or even answerable, but in this case, I wanted to ask whether the process of writing this novel revised you in any way.
Definitely.
I've never asked that before.
Yeah. A lot of writers in their craft books talk about how you write the book, or you need to become the person that can write the book in order to finish it. And Alexander Chi has this really beautiful essay, The Rosary, in his essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, where he talks about tending to roses and the volatile relationship and nature of their persistence and endurance and growth, despite being cut down to survive and to flourish. They always grow back stronger and more resilient. And there's this really beautiful moment where he talks about how he too has become changed as the person tending to the roses, that he was the rose that walked away and grew beyond that plot of a garden that he was taking care of. And so too did I have to think about the novel in those terms, that I was the one walking away, having grown and having healed, because writing this book was very taxing and arduous, especially in having to sit with all of these ghosts and their longings, and to think about deeply this rupture and this ache that I feel that I've carried my entire life without knowing where it originated. And I was able to connect to these stories about family separation, because I was raised apart from my family in Hawaii while they remained in South Korea. And I began to understand what it means to really miss someone, when I sat with these stories, and how we can miss people across our lifetimes and into future lives, and how generations after us still carry that longing and live in that context of separation. So yeah, this book, by the end of it, it helps me to reconcile with my own family's place in this history and the contexts that have shaped the separations that have endured across generations down to me, and which extend way far back, further than I can imagine. And so this book was just an attempt at a beginning to start this process of healing for not only for myself and my family, but I hope for Koreans in the diaspora everywhere. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you for sitting with me, for speaking with me. Thank you for this book, and thank you so much for joining me today on Fully Booked. Joseph, thank you.
Thank you, Megan.